There's a country on earth where you can be executed for listening to the wrong song. Where your hairstyle is chosen by the government. Where a family of 3 men convinced 25 million people they are living gods. And they have nuclear weapons pointed at you. December 2011. North Korean state television makes an announcement. Kim Jong-il is dead. What happens next looks like mass hysteria. Millions flood the streets of Pyongyang, not in celebration, in devastation. Grown men collapse on frozen pavement, sobbing. Women scream and tear at their clothes. Soldiers weep openly. An entire nation appears to be having a collective mental breakdown. Watch this footage and your first thought is probably, this has to be fake. They're being forced to cry. It's all performance. But here's what's actually terrifying. Most of them mean it. Because for 75 years, one family has pulled off the most successful brainwashing experiment in human history. They've convinced an entire country that they control the weather, that they don't need to use the bathroom, that they invented the hamburger. And if you don't believe it, you, your parents, and your children disappear into concentration camps where a former guard estimated 1 in 3 prisoners lose fingers, ears, or eyes to beatings. This is not the funny North Korea you see in memes. This is the real one. The one where a famine killed up to 3.5 million people, while the government made it illegal to say the word famine. Where agents kidnapped a foreign actress and director to make movies for the regime. Where they blew up a passenger plane killing 115 people just to scare tourists away from the Olympics. Where they assassinated the leader's own brother with a chemical weapon in an airport. How did we get here? How does a guerrilla fighter become a god? How does his son starve millions while building the world's tallest flagpole? How does his grandson befriend Dennis Rodman while executing his uncle with a flamethrower? And here's the question that should keep you up at night. How long can this possibly last? Because right now, as you listen to this, Kim Jong-un sits in Pyongyang with nuclear missiles that can reach the continental United States. His hackers have stolen billions of dollars and crippled companies worldwide. His army is one of the largest on Earth. And his people have been taught from birth that America wants to destroy them. The Korean War never actually ended. We just stopped shooting. For now. This is 75 years of history that everyone thinks they know, but almost nobody actually understands. 3 generations. 3 dictators. 1 family dynasty built on lies, violence, and the most complete control over human minds ever achieved. This is the full story of North Korea. And it starts with fire from the sky. To understand how North Korea became the world's most closed society, you need to understand what Korea was before the Kims. 1905. Japan conquers the entire Korean peninsula. For the next 40 years, Korea disappears from the map. It becomes just another piece of the Japanese Empire, and Tokyo presents this as a civilizing mission, bringing modern industry and culture to backward Korea. The Koreans saw it very differently. Thousands of guerrilla fighters resisted until 1910, when Japan finally crushed the last organized resistance. Korea became fully absorbed into the empire. What followed was the standard colonial playbook: industrialization and economic expansion, yes, but with every ounce of wealth flowing back to Tokyo. Korean resources extracted. Korean labor exploited. Koreans treated as second-class citizens, in their own homeland. Japan ran Korea like a military occupation because that's exactly what it was. Armed teachers patrolled schools. A massive militarized police force monitored every aspect of daily life. Step out of line and you disappeared. But the resentment never went away. It just went underground. 1919. The First World War ends with promises of freedom and self-determination for colonized peoples. Koreans believe their moment has come. Massive protests sweep the nation. Millions take to the streets, demanding independence. Japan's response is swift and brutal. In one village, Japanese soldiers round up hundreds of protesters and lock them inside a church. Then they bar the doors and set it on fire. Everyone inside burns to death. It's a message. Resistance will be met with annihilation. But you can't kill an idea. Korean nationalism only grows stronger. And leading that nationalist movement, offering hope, organization, and a vision of the future, are the communists. This is the early 20th century. Communist movements are exploding across the world. Vladimir Lenin just pulled off the impossible in Russia, overthrowing the Tsars and establishing the world's first communist state. For colonized peoples everywhere watching this, communism looks like the answer. Think about the promise: wealth redistribution, an end to profit-seeking, an end to imperialism, a new prosperous beginning where workers control their own destiny. For Koreans suffering under Japanese boots, this sounds like paradise. History would prove those promises hollow. But in the 1920s and 30s, millions believed in the communist dream, especially in Korea. Korean communists became the tip of the anti-Japanese spear. Numerous guerrilla groups and civil organizations emerged throughout the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, all fighting for an independent communist Korea. Japan responded with firing squads, prison camps, and terror. Thousands of fighters died. Thousands more were forced to flee across the border into China. Among those refugees was a young man who would change the course of Korean history forever. His name was Kim Il-sung. 1912. A boy is born near Pyongyang to Christian parents. His early life drowns in layers of propaganda created decades later. But here's what we know. His family got involved in anti-Japanese activities and had to run for their lives. They escaped across the border into Manchuria, China. The boy, young Kim, was still a child. In China, everything changed. China had its own active communist movements, and the teenage Kim Il-sung fell hard for the ideology. As soon as he was old enough, he joined. 1931, he became a card-carrying member of the Chinese Communist Party. He threw himself into anti-Japanese protests and militant action. Then in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. Kim saw his chance. He joined the resistance, hoping to drive Japan out of China and eventually liberate his homeland. And here's the thing. Kim was good at it. He proved himself a talented guerrilla leader. Smart, ruthless, effective. He climbed the ranks quickly, with successful strike after successful strike, operating in both China and Korea. Hit and run attacks. Sabotage missions. Always moving, always fighting, always one step ahead of the Japanese military hunting him. Then came 1937. the moment that made Kim Il-sung a legend. The Battle of Pochonbo. Kim led 200 guerrilla fighters across the Korean border to a small town called Pochonbo. Japanese soldiers were stationed there, occupying Korean territory, secure in their power. They didn't expect what came next. Kim's forces attacked at night. They defeated the Japanese soldiers, burned down the police station, destroyed occupied buildings, and then disappeared back into the mountains before reinforcements could arrive. It wasn't the biggest battle. It wasn't the most strategically important, but it was symbolic. For the first time in decades, Koreans had struck back on Korean soil and won. The victory made Kim Il-sung one of the most famous guerrilla leaders in East Asia. His name spread. Stories of Kim the Tiger inspired resistance fighters across the region. For later North Korean propaganda, this battle became the founding myth, the moment Kim's path to power truly began. Kim himself wrote about it years later, saying, "The flames over the night sky of Pochonbo in the fatherland heralded the dawn of the liberation of Korea, which had been buried in darkness." But fame is dangerous when you're fighting an empire. The Japanese military made Kim Il-sung a priority target. They sent special units to hunt him down. Some sources claim they may have killed his secret first wife during this manhunt, though records are unclear. What we know for certain is that by the late 1930s, the pressure became too intense. Kim had to retreat. He fled north into the Soviet Union. There, he was officially enrolled in the Red Army. He spent most of World War II in hiding and training, waiting for his moment. The Soviets recognized his value, a proven fighter, a Korean nationalist, a committed communist. They kept him safe, trained him further, and waited for the right opportunity to use him. That opportunity came in August 1945. The war was ending. Japan was collapsing. The USSR declared war on Japan, and Soviet armies poured into the Korean peninsula from the north. Kim Il-sung followed shortly after, returning to his homeland for the first time in years. At almost the exact same time, American forces landed in the south. The Japanese occupiers were being evicted. Korea was finally free. But free to do what? That was about to become the question that defined the next 75 years. Because the Allied powers had a plan for Korea, and that plan was about to tear the country in half. After defeating Japan, the Allied powers needed to decide what to do with Korea. The solution they came up with would create one of the most dangerous flashpoints on Earth. American officials pulled out a map. They drew a line across the Korean peninsula at the 38th parallel. North of the line, Soviet occupation zone. South of the line, American occupation zone. This line was apparently chosen in half an hour by two random American colonels. They picked the 38th parallel because it roughly split the peninsula in half. That was the entire thought process. This meaningless line on a map would become one of the most important borders in the world for the next 80 years. Here's the problem. Korea had no natural north-south division. It was one country, one people, one culture. Everyone wanted a united Korean peninsula. They just disagreed on what kind of Korea it should be. The Soviets knew they needed a reliable Korean communist leader to shape the North. So, Joseph Stalin made a personal choice. He reviewed the candidates and selected the greatest of the Korean Communist guerrillas for the job. December 1945. Kim Il-sung became first secretary of the Communist Party of Korea. At 33 years old, this guerrilla fighter suddenly held power over his nation, power he would keep for the next 50 years. But there's a bizarre conspiracy theory about what happened next, and it involves the CIA. The theory claims the Kim Il-sung who entered North Korea in 1945 wasn't the same person who fought at Pochonbo. According to this story, Stalin made the real Kim Il-sung disappear, killed him the way he killed so many other communist figures who threatened his control. Then, Stalin found a lookalike, some criminal he could blackmail, and gave him the Kim Il-sung identity, a puppet he could completely manipulate. It sounds insane, but a CIA investigation into the theory concluded it was probably true. They believed the Kim Il-sung in North Korea was an imposter whose name and identity were stolen from a dead guerrilla leader. A Soviet officer who worked with Kim also wrote privately that the man he knew was an imposter. These days, historians think the theory is nonsense. Several people who knew Kim as a guerrilla confirmed it was the same man. The CIA report was simply wrong, which happens far more often than the CIA likes to admit. Still, it's not impossible that the entire Kim dynasty is built on a Soviet lie. We'll probably never know for certain. What we do know is this: real Kim, or fake Kim, the man who took power in the north, faced serious challenges. Because he wasn't the only communist leader in Korea. 4 rival communist factions threatened Kim's control, and each wanted to push North Korea in a different direction. Kim's own Kapsan faction, the guerrilla faction, held power for now. These were mostly former fighters, whose battlefield effectiveness earned Stalin's faith. But Stalin's faith was awfully fragile. The Soviet Korean faction posed a particular threat. Made up of ethnic Koreans with Soviet citizenship, they leaned heavily toward Moscow. While they hadn't proven themselves enough to earn Stalin's favor outright, Soviet involvement made them a risky rival. Then came the Yan'an faction. Chinese-aligned communists, most members of the Chinese Communist Party. After Mao's communists took power in China in 1949, this faction became a potent threat to Kim's Korea-centric approach. They could pull North Korea toward Beijing instead of independence. Finally, the South Korean communists. Many had fled north when American troops arrived in the south. Their main goal was reunifying the peninsula under communist rule. They were less of an immediate internal threat, but their leader, Pak Hon-yong, was the closest thing Kim had to a genuine rival. Kim and Pak had both been invited to Moscow in 1946 for Stalin to decide which man should lead. Kim won, but Pak remained a force to be reckoned with. To survive, Kim needed to anchor himself somewhere these rivals couldn't challenge him. He chose the military. He'd been a guerrilla fighter for decades. Combat was in his blood. He made military strength a huge part of his ideology, so much so that the foundation date of his anti-Japanese guerrilla force, April 25th, became an annual national holiday. February 1948. This guerrilla force was officially transformed into the Korean People's Army, the KPA. Conscription began immediately, meaning the KPA would always be a formidable force. And the USSR ensured it was well armed, pouring weapons, tanks, planes, and artillery into North Korea. With huge numbers and modern equipment, the KPA became one of the most powerful military forces in the post-war world. Meanwhile, the international community tried to solve the Korea problem through politics. The newly formed United Nations attempted to organize free elections for the entire peninsula. The USSR refused to cooperate, believing the UN was just a puppet controlled by the United States. So, the UN held elections only in the south. August 15, 1948. The Republic of Korea, South Korea, was born under the leadership of Syngman Rhee. As far as the UN was concerned, this was the only legitimate Korean government. The North responded by writing their own constitution. September 9, 1948. They declared themselves the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with Kim Il-sung as premier. North Korea, as we know it today, was finally here. And Kim Il-sung immediately started planning how to reunify the peninsula. By force. Kim Il-sung looked at the situation and liked what he saw. Most American troops withdrew from South Korea in June 1949. The South's military was poorly equipped and badly outnumbered. The North had the vastly superior army, and communism was riding high on recent victories around the world. The USSR detonated their first atomic bomb in August 1949, ending America's nuclear monopoly. In China, Mao's communists overthrew the Republican government and established the People's Republic, another communist ally and a powerful one. Both Stalin and Mao threw their support behind an invasion. Mao even sent at least 50,000 men from the People's Liberation Army to bolster North Korean forces. Stalin was clear, though, he would not send the Red Army. This had to be Korea's show. The South expected trouble. There were several border clashes throughout 1949 and early 1950 that proved hostility between the two Koreas. But no one expected what came next. June 25, 1950. Just after 4 a.m., North Korean tanks, planes, and infantry poured across the border in a massive coordinated assault. The numbers were devastating. The North outnumbered the South 2-1 in infantry, more than 10-1 in aircraft, and the North had almost 300 tanks. South Korea had exactly 0. South Korea collapsed. Within 5 days, Kim's forces controlled Seoul. Almost 80% of South Korea's army was captured, killed, or had deserted. The handful of US troops still on the peninsula could do nothing but run in the face of the overwhelming advance. As they went, North Korean forces systematically targeted ideological enemies. Politicians, anti-communist intellectuals, business leaders, anyone who represented the old South Korean order was hunted down and exterminated by the KPA. Kim Il-sung was euphoric. It looked like he'd won a great victory. Reunification was within his grasp. That euphoria lasted exactly 2 months. The United Nations condemned the invasion immediately. 2 days after the invasion began, the UN approved a unified military response. Naturally, the United States took the lead. Washington worried that if Korea fell to communism, Japan would be threatened next. They feared a domino effect across Asia. General Douglas MacArthur, who'd led US forces in the Pacific during World War II and currently oversaw occupied Japan, was given command of UN coalition forces. September 15, 1950. UN forces launched an amphibious assault at Incheon. It was the largest amphibious operation since World War II, and it shattered the North Korean army. The KPA front collapsed. Tens of thousands of soldiers were captured. The UN quickly retook Seoul, and by the end of September had pushed back to the 38th parallel. Most of North Korea's army had been killed or captured. Then, in October, UN forces crossed into North Korea itself. What looked like a quick victory for Kim had become a total disaster. His government was forced to flee, and Pyongyang fell to UN forces within weeks. Kim Il-sung's dream of reunification was turning into a nightmare. But the true nightmare for North Korea wasn't happening on the ground. It was happening in the sky. If you want to understand why North Korea is the way it is today, you need to understand what happened between 1950 and 1953. As the North Korean army collapsed, UN air forces established complete dominance of the skies. And they used that dominance to unleash one of the most devastating bombing campaigns in human history. The US Air Force led a colossal strategic bombing effort that obliterated North Korea's cities and infrastructure. Entire cities were flattened. Villages were wiped off the map. Pyongyang was bombed so thoroughly that not a single major building remained standing. The American general in charge of air operations said that by October 1950, they stopped sending bomber runs because there was literally nothing left to bomb. Think about that. An entire country ran out of targets. An estimated 80% or more of North Korea's buildings were destroyed. More explosives were dropped on North Korea than were dropped in the entire Pacific Theater during World War II. Let that sink in. More than Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Tokyo, every Pacific island combined. Maybe 10% of North Korea's total population was killed by the bombing. That's roughly 1 in every 10 people dead from the air campaign alone. This is the experience that shaped North Korean attitudes toward the United States more than anything else. Yes, there are ideological disagreements. Yes, the regime pumps out anti-American propaganda constantly. But underneath all that is a very real, very visceral trauma. An entire generation experienced the near-total leveling of their country from the sky. Watched their cities burn. Saw their families crushed under rubble. Lived in caves and tunnels because there were no buildings left standing. The sheer hatred for America that pervades North Korean state and society isn't just manufactured propaganda. It's rooted in this historical devastation. The bombing campaign gave the regime a legitimate grievance to exploit for the next 75 years. But even as North Korea burned, the situation on the ground was about to shift again. Because China was watching. And China had a red line. China warned the UN forces not to get too close to Chinese territory. The warning was ignored. As UN forces pushed deeper into North Korea, approaching the Chinese border, Beijing decided enough was enough. October 25, 1950. Tens of thousands of Chinese troops burst across the border in a massive surprise attack. The UN forces were caught completely unprepared. The sheer number of Chinese soldiers forced a hasty retreat. Chinese and North Korean forces quickly recaptured Pyongyang, pushed the UN back over the 38th parallel, and even retook Seoul briefly, making it the 4th time the city changed hands in less than a year. For Kim Il-sung, the feelings were complicated. On one hand, he was saved. North Korea was back under his control. The threat of total defeat had passed. But on the other hand, he resented everything about how it happened. The strength of UN forces made reunification look impossible. He'd lost so many of his own troops. And worst of all, Chinese soldiers were doing most of the actual fighting now. Both Stalin and Mao blamed the KPA for being too incompetent to win, for causing this war to spiral out of control. Frankly, they didn't trust Pyongyang to handle it anymore. UN forces regrouped and pushed back. Seoul was retaken in March 1951, its fourth and final conquest. Once again, it was the Communists' turn to retreat north, with thousands of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. By July 1951, UN forces reached the 38th parallel again. And there the war stalled. For the next 2 brutal years, from July 1951 to July 1953, the Korean War became a stubborn, grinding stalemate. It was as grueling and frustrating as the trenches of World War I. Casualties mounted on both sides, but no significant territory changed hands. Both sides dug in, fortified positions, artillery, duels, small unit engagements that accomplished nothing, men dying for hills and ridges that would be lost the next week anyway. After several failed negotiation attempts, exhaustion finally brought both sides to the table. July 27, 1953. An armistice was signed. Not a peace treaty. An armistice. Both sides agreed to halt military operations, release prisoners, and return remains of the deceased. The armistice established an internationally monitored, demilitarized zone, the Korean DMZ, along the border to mark the boundary between the two nations. The war was left unfinished. Technically, it still is. Skirmishes and episodes of violence have broken out over the decades, but for the most part, North and South Korea have been locked in a tense standoff that has threatened to explode into devastating war at any moment for the last 70 years. The Korean War killed millions, devastated the peninsula, traumatized multiple generations, and solved absolutely nothing. Both Koreas emerged claiming victory. Both emerged more convinced than ever that they were right and their enemy was evil. And both emerged determined to rebuild, rearm, and prepare for the day the war might start again. For North Korea specifically, the aftermath would be a test. Could Kim Il-sung rebuild a shattered nation? Could he consolidate his power against internal rivals? Could he create the socialist paradise he'd promised his people? The answer to all those questions would shape not just North Korea, but the entire Cold War world. 1953. North Korea emerged from war a broken nation. The army was almost destroyed. Cities were ruins. The population was exhausted, demoralized, traumatized. Overall, economic output had fallen 75% from 1949 to 1953. Energy production, fuel, chemicals, metallurgy, agriculture, all reduced to a fraction of pre-war levels. Kim Il-sung needed a plan. He laid out 4 goals that would guide North Korea through its reconstruction. First, consolidate what he called the people's democratic system. In simpler terms, this meant doubling down on communist ideology and ramping up propaganda to ensure everyone became a loyal citizen. Total ideological control. Second, rebuild the economy and improve living standards. With much of the country in ruins, this was obvious but monumental. Still, with total state control of the economy and support from foreign allies, Pyongyang was confident it could be achieved. Third, improve national defense. The army had to be rebuilt, the border fortified, modern equipment secured. They couldn't let themselves be vulnerable again. Fourth, never give up on reunification. Kim's hopes had been shattered during the war, but the dream remained. Someday, somehow, Korea would be one nation again, under his rule. But before Kim could focus on rebuilding, he had to deal with threats to his power. And his solution was classic authoritarian playbook: blame everyone else. The war had damaged more than just buildings. It damaged the Communist Party's prestige. The Communists promised reunification and delivered stalemate. They promised liberation and delivered devastation. The South Korean masses failed to rise up and join the northern invaders as predicted. Someone had to take the fall. Kim decided to redirect all blame toward his internal rivals. By scapegoating his enemies, he redirected popular resentment away from himself and toward the rival communist factions. By removing these people from power, he crippled his competition and filled government positions with his own loyalists. It was transparent, it was predictable, and it was awfully effective. The Soviet Korean Communist leader Ho Ka-i faced Kim's wrath first. Near the war's end, he was purged from his posts and blamed for failures in the country's response, especially the slow repair of dams and infrastructure destroyed by American bombing. The accusations drove Ho Ka-i to suicide. Or so the regime claimed. Another victim was Kim's old rival, Pak Hon-yong. Remember, Pak was the leader of the South Korean Communist faction. He'd been appointed foreign minister and had promised Kim that Southerners would rise up and join the North when communist forces rolled in. That obviously didn't happen. Kim dismissed him in 1953 and had him arrested on accusations of being an American spy. Only disloyalty, the regime argued, could explain such complete failure. Pak was given a show trial and executed in December 1955. Hundreds of communist officials found themselves fired, imprisoned, or executed in similar fashion in the months after the war. Kim's grip on power tightened with each purge. But the biggest threat to Kim's rule was still coming. August 1956. The faction incident that almost destroyed Kim Il-sung. Earlier that year, the new Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev gave a bombshell speech. He openly denounced Joseph Stalin and his personality cult, along with any other leaders trying to emulate it. It was a pivot away from strongman worship toward collective leadership. North Korea was still heavily dependent on Soviet aid. When Khrushchev summoned Kim to Moscow that summer for a private scolding about his own growing personality cult, Kim had no choice but to go. And while Kim was away, his enemies saw an opportunity. Soviet and Yan'an faction leaders hatched a conspiracy. They shared Khrushchev's disgust with personality cults and decided to confront Kim about it. They also planned to criticize his regime's economic policies and his obvious bias toward his own guerrilla faction. When Kim returned for the annual party conference in late August, he walked into an ambush. Pak Chang-ok, leader of the Soviet faction, and Cho Chang-ik, leader of the Yan'an faction, took to the stage with several allies. They tore into Kim publicly, calling him a tyrant and egomaniac whose actions undermined socialist principles. They expected support. They calculated that others would join them, that this would be Kim's downfall. They badly miscalculated. The Soviet and Yan'an factions were too obviously anchored in foreign powers. Kim, meanwhile, was a nationalist hero, a true Korean who'd fought the guerrilla fight to free his nation. For many, Kim represented Juche, self-reliance, while his enemies would submit North Korea to Moscow or Beijing. At the party conference, Kim's critics were shouted down. The party voted to expel Pak Chang-ok and Cho Chang-ik. And over the following months, Kim launched a massive purge. Dozens of leaders from both factions disappeared. It's unknown exactly how many died, but it was extensive enough that Beijing and Moscow sent a joint delegation begging Kim to stop. Kim ignored them. Most victims simply vanished, sent to labor camps, shot, and buried in unmarked graves, forgotten. About 11 people were convicted in show trials and publicly executed as enemies of the state. By 1960, both Pak and Cho were dead. The Soviet and Yan'an factions had been completely destroyed. And there was no one left in North Korea who would dare challenge Kim Il-sung's power. Kim had survived. More than survived, he'd emerged stronger than ever, with absolute control. Now, he could finally focus on the future he'd promised his people. A future built on a single guiding principle: self-reliance. If you want to understand North Korea, you must understand Juche. Kim Il-sung first expressed the elements of this ideology in a 1955 speech, and it would become the guiding principle of the entire country. The word essentially means self-reliance. The idea is straightforward. North Korea strives to be militarily, socially, and economically capable of standing on its own 2 feet. Cooperation with fellow socialist states is welcome, but dependence undermines the country's power. Economically, this meant rejecting international trade as the path to prosperity. Instead, North Korea would focus on self-sufficiency. The DPRK would grow all its own food, develop all its own technology, extract all its own raw materials. Complete independence from the global economy. Socially, it meant thorough education in Juche ideology for all citizens and insulation from outside ideas that might compromise the nation's ideological unity. Foreign influence was dangerous. It had to be controlled, filtered, or eliminated entirely. All of this existed within a Marxist-Leninist framework. But Kim stressed that Korean thought and Korean experiences should determine how those ideas were applied. Soviet or Chinese communism might work for them, but North Korea needed a Korean solution. Juche also defined North Korea against South Korea. For Kim, the North was a fiercely independent nation standing on its own. The South, by contrast, was an American puppet, shackled to its trading partners and military alliances, dependent on foreign powers for survival. The North was strong. The South was weak. That was the narrative. But Juche is more than just practical philosophy. It's also an intense, almost religious love of North Korea. One historian described Juche as an assumption that Korea is at the center of the world. All citizens of the DPRK must passionately love their country, and by extension, they must love its leader. This is where Juche becomes dangerous. Because it's not enough to agree with government policy. It's not enough to follow the law. You must genuinely, deeply, emotionally love North Korea and Kim Il-sung with every fiber of your being. Anything less is betrayal. Understanding Juche is the key to understanding everything that follows. The isolationism, the propaganda, the paranoia about foreign influence, the personality cult, the willingness to let people starve rather than accept too much foreign aid. It all flows from this ideology. Kim Il-sung created Juche. And Juche, in turn, would shape North Korea for the next 75 years. But ideology alone wasn't enough to maintain power. Kim needed his people to see him not just as a leader, but as something more. Something divine. August 1953. Kim Il-sung unveiled his vision for economic recovery, the 3-year plan. It would run from 1954 to 1956 and guide North Korea's resurrection from the ashes. The plan was ambitious. Massive investment to boost industrial and agricultural output. Heavy industry was the main priority. Over 80% of all industrial investment went to sectors like mining, steel production, and construction. The plan set extensive quotas for every industry and directed workers to devote themselves completely to laboring for the state. According to Pyongyang, it was a triumph. By early 1957, industrial and agricultural production had supposedly returned to pre-war levels. Mission accomplished. But external observers noticed something wrong with the numbers. Thanks to all that investment, heavy industry probably had improved beyond pre-war levels. But vital sectors like agriculture and fishing had not. The regime was playing games with statistics, taking success in one area and pretending it represented the whole economy. The focus on quotas and output created a catastrophic problem. Just like China, during the Great Leap Forward, North Korea's obsession with meeting targets led to systemic lying. Regional officials who failed to meet agricultural quotas were punished. So, officials lied. They reported false numbers to save themselves. Those lies travelled up the chain, lie upon lie upon lie, leaving Pyongyang with a completely warped view of reality. This was especially devastating for farmers. The state would seize food based on exaggerated reports of output. Officials claimed a farm produced 10,000 kilograms of grain, so the state took 8,000. But the farm only actually produced 6,000. The remaining 2,000 had to come from somewhere. It came from the farmer's own food supply. 1955. Famine swept through North Korea. Thousands died. This disaster was hidden from the non-communist world. Even Pyongyang's allies in Beijing and Moscow were kept partially in the dark. Both countries sent food aid when they learned the truth, but not enough to make up the deficit. The famine could harm communism's image abroad, so it had to be buried. The regime worked hard to erase all evidence. It was only in the 2000s, when historians began combing through Soviet archives, that the famine's existence was rediscovered. Data remains incomplete, but estimates suggest 800,000 people died between 1954 and 1955. The East German government at the time believed that as many as 25% of North Korea's children starved to death. But Kim Il-sung declared the 3-year plan a success anyway, and moved forward with even bigger ambitions. The 5-year plan ran from 1957 to 1961. While the first plan focused on reconstruction, this one aimed at modernization, bringing North Korea into the future. The problem remained the same. Pyongyang was still obsessed with heavy industry over everything else. The common people still lacked adequate food, housing, and clothing. Both China and the USSR criticized Kim's approach and urged him to change course. Kim ignored them and stayed his course. To ramp up production, Kim launched the Cholima movement, the Flying Horse campaign. It was a massive propaganda effort to boost productivity. Factories and workers who exceeded monthly quotas received medals and recognition. Workers were organized into teams to compete for maximum output. They were communists, yes, but even North Korea realized competition could be good for the economy. The press filled with stories of Cholima riders, workers whose dedication and output were held up as symbols of true patriotism. Kim also began personally visiting production sites to encourage and inspire workers. These became huge propaganda features for the regime. Another key element was on-the-spot guidance. Kim would show up at farms, factories, or facilities unannounced. According to propaganda, he would use his immense wisdom to instruct workers on how to improve and achieve their quotas. On the spot, guidance became one of the most iconic parts of regime propaganda and has been continued by all Kim Il-sung's successors. The motivation campaigns combined with aggressive nationalization and reorganization. By 1958, North Korea had collectivized every single farm. By 1959, it reached full nationalization of all industry and trade. The state controlled everything. But the obsession with quotas and productivity had dark sides. The pressure to exceed targets led to punishment and social consequences for workers or teams who fell behind. The government even launched a "Drink No Soup" campaign, encouraging workers not to eat or drink during work hours so they wouldn't need bathroom breaks. Let that sink in. They told people not to drink water so they could work more. So, was the 5-year plan successful? It's complicated. The more Kim pushed, the more workers became exhausted. Quality declined even as quantity increased. Kim complained that companies rushed to meet monthly quotas with shoddy workmanship, goods and materials that fell apart immediately. By the late 50s and early 60s, production growth stalled again. In theory, by 1959, North Korea met its targets and the government declared the plan completed ahead of schedule. The big picture numbers looked impressive. North Korea's per capita GDP was $140, well above the South's 81. Many industries showed production increases of 50% or more. But that GDP was inflated by industrial output at the expense of food, clothing, and housing. The average North Korean remained desperately poor, living in temporary structures, many suffering from malnutrition. Industrial development came before the well-being of people. The state also conveniently altered statistics. Industries like coal, steel, copper, and fertilizer that failed to meet targets simply weren't counted. Grain output was mysteriously absent from official 1959 statistics. Tellingly, the government immediately planned a year of adjustment in 1960 to rebalance the numbers. And never again would North Korea publish thorough data about its economic situation. The numbers game had become too obvious. Better to hide everything behind state secrets than let the world see the truth. But economic reorganization wasn't the only way Kim was restructuring North Korean society. He was also creating a caste system that would determine every aspect of people's lives. A system still in place today. 1957. North Korea launched the Songbun system, essentially a caste system designed to distinguish loyal families from potential threats. Songbun sorted every single North Korean into one of three overarching classes. The core comprised about 28% of the population. These were people descended from the original guerrillas and revolutionaries, families of soldiers who died in the war, and those from traditional peasant backgrounds. This group was seen as the most loyal and trustworthy. They were allies to the end. The largest group, 45%, were the wavering. This included foreign-born Koreans, families of defectors, members of the middle class, and people in certain occupations, like small traders and teachers. This group wasn't necessarily disloyal, but they couldn't be trusted to be completely devoted. If things turned bad economically or politically, the regime knew these people might turn against them. Finally, roughly 27% belonged to the hostile class. Political prisoners, religious people, supporters of the South, descendants of businessmen and landlords, anyone the regime considered an enemy. These people were not to be trusted and had to be closely monitored for any hint of disloyalty or anti-communist action. But it didn't stop there. Every North Korean was sorted into one of 50 subcategories within these three main classes. Your Songbun determined everything about your life. What jobs you could have, who you could marry, what healthcare you received, what schools you could attend, even how much food was distributed to you. The regime maintained a file on every North Korean above the age of 17 to keep track of their Songbun. Good deeds might move you up the scale, but moving up was much harder than moving down. Missing work quotas, committing a crime, showing any disloyalty, these could devastate your Songbun instantly. This system created a society where your birth determined your destiny. If you were born into the hostile class, you were marked for life. Your children would be marked. Your grandchildren would be marked. No amount of loyalty could fully wash away the stain. And at the top of this entire system sat one man, Kim Il-sung. By the mid-50s, Kim wasn't just a political leader anymore. He was becoming something more. 1953. Kim declared himself Suryong, the great leader. He became a sort of embodiment of the nation itself. An attack on Kim was an attack on North Korea. Disloyalty to Kim was disloyalty to your homeland. The personality cult grew quickly out of control. It became illegal to write over a photo of Kim Il-sung. Illegal to wrap things in newspapers that mentioned his name. Even printing his photo on poor quality paper was an offence. His portrait had to hang in every home, and it had to be on the highest quality paper available. The 20th century already had no shortage of dictators with personality cults. Stalin, Mao, Hitler, the list goes on. But Kim Il-sung's cult would eventually put all of them to shame. The level of worship Kim and his descendants receive in North Korea to this day is one of the most striking and disturbing aspects of the regime. At first, Kim was following in the footsteps of contemporaries like Stalin. But that much power and prestige can make anyone unhinged. And by becoming the representative of the nation, Kim ensured that any attack on him was seen as an attack on North Korea itself. In a country that emphasized absolute loyalty to the nation, loyalty to the dictator became inevitable. But the cult wasn't just about Kim. It was about creating a perfect image of North Korea. The propaganda machine churned out claims that North Korea was paradise on earth, free from the miseries affecting other nations. According to one kindergarten teacher, there was no such thing as blindness or deafness in North Korean children because those were failures of the pre-revolutionary world. School teachers claimed students never missed lessons and never misbehaved. There was supposedly no alcoholism in North Korea, no prostitution, no divorce, no premarital sex, and certainly no homosexuality, which the regime saw as an anti-socialist perversion. The reality was quite different. One foreign visitor noted something disturbing. Despite the recent war causing thousands of injuries, he never saw a single person who was scarred, mutilated, or disabled. Not one. He asked the obvious question, what have they done with them all? The answer was simple. Anything or anyone that made the regime look bad was removed from public view. Some were merely hidden away. Others would experience the dark underside of Kim's paradise. The prison camps. A regime like North Korea needed effective ways to punish dissenters. The elaborate system of prison and labor camps first established by Kim Il-sung's government remains one of the most effective and terrifying in the world. It's remarkably easy to end up in a North Korean prison. The slightest accusation of disloyalty or anti-socialist activity from a party official or someone higher on the Songbun scale could be enough to make you disappear. Trials were little more than ideological performances. A judge would berate the accused for being a traitor and enemy to North Korea before inevitably sentencing them to years in prison. There was no real defense. No due process. Just condemnation and punishment. The North Korean prison system borrowed heavily from Stalin's infamous gulags. They were designed to handle not just regular criminals, but political dissidents, people whose only crimes were against the ideas of the regime. Virtually all North Korean prisons were and are labor camps. Inmates were subjected to forced labor to produce goods or extract raw materials for the regime. This ensured their labor wasn't wasted in idleness and theoretically gave them work skills if they were ever lucky enough to be released. Many prisons also served as re-education camps. These were known as kyowaso. The idea was to reform prisoners through labor and ideological instruction, turning enemies into loyal citizens. Then, there were the concentration camps for political prisoners, the kwanliso. These were for prisoners beyond redemption, people for whom re-education wouldn't work. Only hard labor or total isolation were suitable punishments. Political rivals like those purged after the August faction incident ended up here. So did dissidents, critics, attempted defectors, and sometimes serious violent criminals. Prisoners in all camps faced horrific conditions. Barely enough food to survive. Routine beatings as punishment for the smallest infractions. One former camp guard estimated that at least 1/3 of inmates were mutilated over time, losing fingers, ears, or eyes to guard beatings. That same guard recalled a chilling reality. As far as the regime was concerned, inmates were not human beings. There were no human rights protections for anyone in North Korean captivity. Guards could do whatever they wanted, with complete impunity. This prison system became the foundation of control. Fear kept people in line. Everyone knew someone who'd disappeared. Everyone knew what happened if you stepped out of line. The threat of the camps hung over every aspect of North Korean life. With Kim's power now absolutely secure, the economy slowly rebuilding, society reorganized along strict class lines, and a prison system ready to swallow anyone who resisted, North Korea entered the 1960s with everything to play for. But Kim wasn't satisfied with just controlling his own country. He had bigger ambitions. He wanted to modernize, to compete with the world, to build a military that could challenge anyone. And he was willing to make a deal with the devil to do it. The 1960s brought a fascinating contradiction to North Korea's Juche ideology of total self-reliance. Kim Il-sung wanted to improve heavy industry and realized he needed help. So he compromised on Juche and decided to import equipment. The USSR was initially their main supplier. But friction over pricing and delivery terms led North Korea to do something unthinkable. They turned to the West. Pyongyang realized it was cheaper to buy industrial plants and machinery from Western countries and Japan. Often, these goods were much higher quality than Soviet models. So Kim declared the Great Leap Onward policy, using Western technology to jumpstart Korean development. They imported billions of dollars worth of equipment on credit. Japan alone extended about $1 billion in credit. Western businesses were happy to embrace a new market, and the fact they were snubbing the Soviets didn't hurt either. North Korea used this equipment to establish the world's largest cement factory, along with massive production facilities for steel, paper, fertilizer, and chemicals. The West went from almost nothing to over 40% of North Korea's total trade. It was a golden moment of engagement. Brief, but significant. These years of interaction faded quickly when it became obvious North Korea had no intention of paying back the loans. They'd bought everything on credit and simply defaulted. Western companies learned an expensive lesson about doing business with Pyongyang. But this brief opening did generate Western interest in the Hermit Kingdom. And it created a special temptation for a handful of men. Men like James Joseph Dresnok. Dresnok was a US soldier who'd had a rough life. His parents divorced when he was young. He never finished high school. He had run-ins with the law before enlisting at 17. He married young but returned from deployment in Germany to find his wife had left him for another man. When Dresnok was redeployed to South Korea in 1962, he'd lost all hope. He was treating his depression with alcohol. His behavior earned him a court-martial. No wife, no career, no future. So, Dresnok decided life in the DPRK couldn't possibly be worse than his current situation. August 15th, 1962. Dresnok ran across a minefield in the demilitarized zone and straight into the arms of rather shocked North Korean soldiers. He was interrogated, but they soon realized he genuinely wanted to live in North Korea. After initial hesitation, the regime accepted him. Dresnok was given a home and became a North Korean citizen. He was one of at least 7 known American defectors to the country. In his new life, Dresnok became an English teacher and occasionally acted in state propaganda films. He and other American defectors often played American soldiers in war movies, becoming minor celebrities. Another defector, who later returned to the West, claimed they were closely monitored by state security and sometimes beaten or interrogated on suspicion of being spies. But if this is true, it didn't deter Dresnok. He lived the rest of his life in North Korea, married twice, had children, and died in November 2016. His children remain there today, holding important jobs and planning to stay for the rest of their lives. While a few defections like Dresnok's weren't going to change the military balance, Kim was obsessed with rebuilding his armed forces. The 1960s saw him focus intensely on military reconstruction. The government coined the slogan, "Arms in one hand, hammer and sickle in the other," to emphasize the military's importance. North Korea continued massive recruitment. All eligible citizens had to serve 8 years in one branch or another. Most equipment still came from the USSR and China well into the 1950s. Maybe 5% of annual expenditure went to the military, substantial, but not as high as it would become in later years. With no wars to fight, soldiers were regularly assigned to work projects around the country, providing easy labor that could be deployed wherever needed. Beyond its obvious military use, a strong army served another purpose: indoctrination. Kim wanted to instill military discipline in the next generation. All children were required to practice with firearms starting when they were 7 years old. 7. This military resurgence had economic benefits too. Kim envisioned a militarily self-sufficient North Korea that could manufacture a rifle for every citizen and enough tanks, planes, and artillery to match the South and its American allies. This concept was called Byungjin, the idea that military development was deeply tied to economic development. It has remained relevant in North Korean thought ever since. As the military grew stronger, Kim purged unreliable officials. In the late 60s, top military men, including the Minister of National Security, the Chief of Southern Intelligence, and the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, were removed from power, along with at least 10 top generals. This was less about them being threats and more about Kim tightening control, replacing these men with even more dependable allies. But while Kim strengthened his military, his relationship with Moscow and Beijing was deteriorating. Moscow remained uncomfortable with Kim's personality cult. But it was China who was most unhappy with Kim. North Korea's poor performance in the Korean War had earned contempt from China's political and military leadership. The fact that China shouldered most of the fighting burden created lasting resentment. Kim's tight control also conflicted with Mao's enthusiasm for popular revolution. When Mao's Red Guards launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966, waging a campaign of terror and vandalism across China, Kim Il-sung condemned them. To him, it was dangerous popular unrest that risked undermining state stability. The Red Guards had no love for Kim either. They dubbed him a fat revisionist who wasn't worthy of being called a communist. Perhaps these wounds to his pride made Kim lash out. Perhaps it was the massive military build-up creating appetite for conflict. Whatever the reason, Kim Il-sung was about to drag the Korean peninsula to the brink of war once again. And this time, it would last for years. 1966. Inspired by the success of the Viet Cong in Vietnam, Kim Il-sung devised plans for guerrilla infiltrators to slip across the DMZ and wreak havoc on the south. After over a decade of stalemate, it seemed he wanted to roll the dice on conflict once more. Incursions and firefights along the DMZ weren't unheard of. There were usually a few dozen encounters per year. But in 1966, these incidents increased tenfold. Almost daily skirmishes erupted as North Korean guerrillas were caught in South Korean territory. As tensions rose, border guards became more aggressive. Disputes that might have been resolved with words now ended in gunfire. This period is sometimes called the Second Korean War, though there were no major battles. Instead, hundreds of tiny skirmishes and guerrilla attacks stretched over 3 years. Casualties mounted on both sides. The US declared the area around the demilitarized zone a hostile fire zone. The entire border became a powder keg waiting to explode. Then came the most dire episode of the entire conflict. A daring and disastrous assassination attempt that nearly restarted the war. North Korea became convinced that eliminating South Korean President Park Chung-hee would weaken the South and cause chaos. They believed the people would rise up, throw out the American occupiers, and embrace communism. It was delusional, but Pyongyang believed it. January 17th, 1968. 31 elite North Korean commandos slipped across the DMZ into South Korea under cover of darkness. Their mission: infiltrate President Park's residence at the Blue House in Seoul and eliminate him. Each man had been hand-picked and trained extensively in infiltration techniques. They'd rehearsed this mission dozens of times. And most importantly, they'd been pumped full of North Korean propaganda about how the southern masses were oppressed and eager to join them. They avoided detection for several days, moving carefully through the countryside towards Seoul. Then, on January 20th, they encountered 4 civilian woodcutters. These civilians might have feared for their lives, but they were saved by North Korea's own propaganda. The DPRK had assured its people that Southerners were desperate for communist liberation. So, the commandos didn't kill the woodcutters. Instead, they explained the virtues of communism, promised everyone would soon be united in wonderful communist bliss, and let them go. Naturally, the woodcutters immediately reported the encounter to police. Within hours, the warning relayed up the chain of command. South Korea didn't know what the commandos wanted, but they mobilized everything in the area to find them and put the whole country on high alert. The North Koreans managed to reach Seoul undetected despite the manhunt. But their original plan was now impossible. The city was crawling with soldiers. These men had been trained well, though. They adapted. With soldiers everywhere, the commandos simply blended in. They stole South Korean military uniforms. January 20th. The full group of 31 armed men walked down the street in broad daylight toward the president's residence at the Blue House. 31 enemy soldiers in stolen uniforms walking through the capital. They got within 800 meters of the president's house before curious policemen stopped them. It didn't take long for police to see through the disguises. Their cover blown, the commandos opened fire. 1 policeman died, and 2 North Koreans fell before the commandos scattered in different directions. A massive manhunt launched in the following days. South Korean and American forces swept the city and countryside, hunting down the scattered commandos. Of the 31 commandos, just one escaped back across the border. One more was captured alive. All the rest were killed. The Blue House raid was an embarrassment for both sides. North Korean soldiers foolishly blew their own cover and failed their mission. But had those 4 civilians not warned authorities, the commandos might have succeeded. Even with Seoul on high alert, they got within 800 meters of their target. The raid could have sparked major war. But by sheer luck, it happened just as the Tet Offensive exploded in Vietnam. American attention was dragged away, guaranteeing the US wouldn't commit to another Asian war. Kim Il-sung denied involvement and blamed rogue elements. But other North Korean actions, at the same time, paint a different picture. A mere 3 days after the Blue House raid, North Korea captured an American ship. The USS Pueblo was performing intelligence, gathering several miles off the coast when it was intercepted by North Korean Navy and Air Force units. Officially, the Pueblo was in international waters. North Korea claimed it violated their maritime border. This dispute has never been resolved. The North Koreans pursued when the Pueblo tried to flee. They fired warning shots. One sailor was killed before the Pueblo surrendered, and its entire crew was taken prisoner. It took days to confirm the ship's fate. Washington scrambled for a response, but desperately wanted to avoid making things worse. Not only might hostages be killed, but US resources were consumed dealing with the Tet Offensive. Meanwhile, the crew suffered the misery and torture of North Korean captivity. Pyongyang closed schools and evacuated citizens to the countryside in early 1968, anticipating an American nuclear attack. The entire region braced for war. Then, in late October, North Korea sent over 100 infiltrators into the south again. Almost all were caught within weeks in operations that left about 150 people dead on both sides. The murder of an entire family at Gabang Mountain, including a 10-year-old boy, by the infiltrators intensified South Korea's response. It also made the idea of a pro-communist southern uprising look even more absurd. The global community feared full-scale war. Diplomats from communist, capitalist, and non-aligned nations urged de-escalation. Even Moscow was unhappy. During an April 1968 party conference, Premier Brezhnev openly condemned North Korea for trying to drag the world into another conflict. We don't know exactly what led Kim Il-sung to wind down provocations in 1969. The anger of the USSR and China, fear of actual war, or changing domestic circumstances might all explain it. We only know that Pyongyang eased off over the following months. By late '69, the Pueblo crew were released, and hostile encounters along the DMZ returned to pre-66 levels. It's possible Kim's massive military build-up created appetite for conflict. It's also likely the purge of North Korean generals in the late 60s was a direct result of these failures. Overall, the Second Korean War was pointless. It claimed an estimated 400 South Korean and American lives, along with hundreds of North Koreans. It accomplished nothing. It solved nothing. It only deepened hatreds and proved that reunification through force remained impossible. But at least the fighting was over. For now. Here's something that might surprise you. North Korea's economy wasn't always a disaster. Throughout the 1960s and into the 70s, North Korea's per capita GDP was comparable to, or even higher than South Korea's. By many metrics, life in 1970s North Korea was relatively decent, at least in the first half of the decade. Almost all homes had electricity by the mid-70s. Nearly 70% of the population had urbanized as agricultural improvements reduced the need for rural farmers. Education improved dramatically, with virtually all children enrolled in school and over 200 universities established across the country, all with free tuition. One of the biggest success stories was national healthcare. The hospitals remained underfunded, yes, but mandatory health checkups and vaccination programs instituted under Kim Il-sung left North Korea with unusually high life expectancy and low infant mortality despite its relative poverty. To this day, North Korea enjoys an average life expectancy of about 73 years. That's lower than the US or developed countries, but considerably higher than other nations of comparable economic status. The healthcare system was genuinely impressive. It remains one of the few legitimate achievements of the Kim regime. But Kim's promises far exceeded reality. He'd once claimed he would create a North Korea where everyone wore silk, lived in houses with tiled roofs, and ate 3 full meals every day. North Korea made progress, yes. But this dream of luxury, a dream already real for millions in the West, remained distant. And worse, North Korea's progress toward that goal was about to grind to a halt. By the mid-70s, the economy showed signs of serious struggle. The Cholima movement had exhausted the workforce. Production was steadily declining. Imports of Western machinery had stalled when it became obvious Pyongyang wouldn't pay its debts. Global economic challenges throughout the decade, including the 1973 oil crisis, had knock-on effects that shook the already fragile nation. In 1976, North Korea was forced to stop all debt repayments to the West. It was a dire sign of the state of the nation's finances. Things weren't all bad. Residential construction projects finally addressed housing shortages that had plagued the country since the war. There had been undeniable development in industry and agriculture. But the North was rapidly falling behind its southern neighbors in prosperity, quality of life, and industrial output. North Korea's pride suffered especially as South Korea and Japan began rapid economic rises that catapulted them ahead in the 70s. As the South soared, North Korea became increasingly dependent on Soviet and Chinese allies. By the end of the decade, North Korea was effectively a vassal state of the USSR, relying on them for economic subsidies and diplomatic muscle, while watching its enemy achieve unprecedented prosperity. The shifting winds of global politics presented new challenges too. After the US withdrawal from Vietnam, Kim entertained the idea of reunification again. If Vietnam could defeat the US, he argued, surely North Korea could too. He presented this possibility to Mao Zedong. But this wasn't 1951 anymore. North Korea's military advantage over the South had shrunk dramatically. The US embarrassment in guerrilla warfare said little about its power in conventional combat. And Beijing hadn't forgotten that their soldiers shouldered most of the fighting after saving Kim's last disastrous war. Frankly, they didn't trust Pyongyang to win. The other reason China refused was its newfound effort to build bridges with the West. By the mid-70s, China was actively working to reduce hostilities with the US and build economic ties. The Nixon administration eagerly cooperated, hoping to deepen the divide between Moscow and Beijing. Allowing North Korea to start another war would ruin those efforts. Kim's plans were shelved when he realized the old Cold War alliance structure was crumbling. The reliable partnership with China and the USSR in eternal opposition to the West was falling apart. To counter this, Kim found new allies outside the communist bloc. Fellow communists like Pol Pot in Cambodia proved short-lived partners. But one successful area of North Korean diplomacy was Africa. Kim found fast friends among the continent's most brutal dictators. Men like Idi Amin and Jean Bedel Bokassa, dictators whose craving for power and control matched Kim's own. Another appropriately psychotic friend was Francisco Macias Nguema, the ruthless dictator of Equatorial Guinea. Nguema turned his country into a hellish personality cult. His official nickname was the Great Miracle, and priests were required to praise him in every service. He shared North Korea's bloodlust too. In one instance, Nguema had 200 people massacred in a football stadium while blasting pop music over the speakers. Equatorial Guinea was easily one of the worst places in the world to live. They called it the Auschwitz of Africa for good reason. As a sign of friendship, Nguema sent his daughter Monica to be raised and educated in Pyongyang in 1979. It was just in time. Nguema was ousted and killed months later. But Kim Il-sung kept his promise to his departed friend. Monica was given the best education North Korea could provide. Kim regularly called to check on her, made sure she had everything she wanted. Monica is still alive today and proudly considers Kim Il-sung her second father. She's written books defending both Nguema and Kim as good men unfairly smeared by Western propaganda. These alliances with African dictators didn't solve North Korea's fundamental problems. But they did show Kim's willingness to find friends wherever he could, even if those friends were monsters. And speaking of finding friends in unexpected places, the DMZ was about to witness one of the strangest incidents in its entire history. An incident that started with a tree. The DMZ remained a tinderbox that could be ignited by the simplest thing, including a tree. August 18, 1976. A small group of US and South Korean soldiers, led by Captain Arthur Boniface and Lieutenant Mark Barrett, entered the DMZ with a simple mission: trim a tree that was blocking the view from a UN command post. Just routine maintenance. Nothing special. A group of North Korean soldiers came over and watched them closely. After a while, the North Koreans became belligerent. They demanded Captain Boniface and his men stop working and leave immediately. Boniface turned his back to them and kept working. He didn't even acknowledge the demands. Then suddenly, without warning, about 30 North Korean soldiers, armed with crowbars, metal pipes, and other makeshift weapons, pounced on the Americans and South Koreans. Captain Boniface was beaten to death on the spot. Lieutenant Barrett escaped to a nearby ditch, but the North Korean soldiers found him there. They attacked him with the same axes the work crew had been using to trim the tree. Both men died from their injuries. They were both armed, but never drew their weapons, probably terrified that gunfire would only make things catastrophically worse. Immediately, North Korean state media spun the attack as American aggression. North Korea's international allies echoed this propaganda. Video, photographic, and eyewitness evidence completely refuted the claims. But the regime made sure the North Korean people only saw their version of events. If Pyongyang hoped the US would back down, they were badly mistaken. The United States refused to take the murder of 2 soldiers lightly. But they also didn't want to start a war over a tree. So they planned something in between. Operation Paul Bunyan, named after the famous lumberjack folk hero. The US had a single goal. They were going to cut that tree down and dare Pyongyang to try stopping them. They called in an army's worth of resources. Hundreds of armed soldiers, martial arts specialists, armored vehicles, attack helicopters circling overhead, a fleet of bombers, fighter jets. The aircraft carrier USS Midway moved into position offshore. Practically every US and Allied military base in East Asia was put on full alert, ready to assist if needed. With enough firepower to conquer a small country assembled behind them, the US sent a work team into the DMZ to chop down that tree once and for all. A few hundred North Korean soldiers stationed at the border could only watch in stunned silence as American troops brought it down. Helicopters and bombers circled menacingly on the horizon. The message was clear: try something and see what happens. 45 minutes later, Operation Paul Bunyan was declared a success. The tree was down. The stump was left standing for a few years. Now a memorial stands on the spot, honoring Boniface and Barrett. North Korea, apparently shocked by the lengths the US would go for a tree, didn't apologize. But Kim Il-sung did something unprecedented. He expressed regret that the incident had gotten out of hand. He said both sides needed to commit to keeping the peace. It wasn't much, but it was the closest the Kim regime had ever come to accepting responsibility for something terrible. The Paul Bunyan incident didn't solve tensions along the DMZ. Not by a long shot, but subsequent disagreements were generally more civil. Sometimes even downright silly. Like the flagpole war of the 1980s. It's exactly what it sounds like. South Korea erected a 98-meter flagpole near the border, so their flag could be seen from the north. Taking lessons from American showmanship, North Korea answered with a 160-meter flagpole that absolutely dwarfed their neighbors. The flag alone weighed almost 600 pounds. To this day, this monument to North Korean vanity remains the tallest flagpole in the world. But while North Korea played games with flagpoles, something far more important was happening behind the scenes. Kim Il-sung was aging. He was pushing 70 by 1980. And he needed to prepare for succession. His solution would ensure the Kim dynasty for another generation. Kim Jong-il had been hidden from the spotlight for the first 30 years of his life. Born in a Soviet military camp in 1941 to Kim Il-sung and his first wife, young Kim's childhood is obscured behind layers of propaganda. Later myths would claim he was born on a sacred mountain under a new star, but the truth is far more mundane. Kim Jong-il first emerged into corridors of power in the 1970s. He joined the Central Committee in 1972. By 1974, he was the designated heir. He was given important roles, managing espionage and propaganda for the regime, and gradually accumulated power behind the scenes. From the 80s onward, he was put into public view and given thorough heroic treatment. Soon his portrait hung alongside his father's in every home. Kim Jong-il was described as the party center, the man who would maintain the revolution and continue his father's work. One of his first major responsibilities was coordinating propaganda to improve the DPRK's image. And despite his ideological opposition to Western ideas, Kim Jong-il was famously a huge film buff. He owned a massive collection of foreign films that would have earned a regular North Korean a trip to the labor camps. Working with the propaganda department, Kim dreamed of making North Korea a communist Hollywood. Instead of cowboys and American soldiers, he envisioned films singing the praises of communism and retelling Kim Il-sung's glorious revolution. The trouble was, North Korea didn't have people talented enough to make films that could compete with Hollywood. Kim made a few of his own during the 70s, but any applause from North Korean audiences was forced. He knew he needed real talent, and he knew exactly where to find it. January 1978. North Korean agents approached South Korean actress Choi Eun-hee while she was in Hong Kong. They shoved her onto a boat and took her to North Korea. Despite the kidnapping, Choi was treated remarkably well. She was given a tour of the country, met Kim Il-sung himself, and spent time visiting theatres, operas, and parties across North Korea. 6 months later, North Korean agents grabbed another South Korean film expert in Hong Kong. The director, Shin Sang-ok, who happened to be Choi's ex-husband. Kim intentionally kidnapped both to reunite them in North Korea. He hoped compelling them to work together would make them want to stay. After several failed escape attempts by Shin, they finally gave in. Choi and Shin remarried and spent the next 8 years making movies for the regime. Some films were exactly what you'd expect. Productions of Kim Jong-il's own screenplays. Tales of Kim Il-sung's glorious resistance against the Japanese. Choi even won an award for her performance in one propaganda film about a peasant woman joining communists in Japanese-occupied China. But the best film had to be Pulgasari, a North Korean Godzilla ripoff about a magic iron-eating dragon that helps peasants overthrow a corrupt emperor. You can watch it online today. Kenpachiro Satsuma, one of the actors who played Godzilla, admitted that Pulgasari was actually better than some of the actual Godzilla films. Unfortunately, there would be no sequel. Choi and Shin were well treated, but they remained prisoners. During a visit to Vienna in 1986 to secure funding for their next film, they managed to sneak away from their North Korean guards. They escaped to the US Embassy and finally gained their freedom. North Korea's film industry would never see wonders like Pulgasari again. But at least Choi and Shin were finally free. They weren't the only people kidnapped by North Korea in this period. And many others would never get the chance to escape. Throughout the 1970s, Pyongyang kidnapped hundreds of foreigners and smuggled them back to the DPRK. Most targets were taken from Japan, though kidnappings from France, Malaysia, and other countries were also documented. There was no real pattern. They occurred at any place, any time. Sometimes young couples. Other times, a lone man or woman. In one case, a 13-year-old girl. The victims would be taken to North Korea and forced to live there for the rest of their lives. If abducted as a couple, they'd be split up temporarily and then reunited after thorough indoctrination. If alone, they'd eventually be paired with another captive of the opposite sex. They'd be given a home, expected to marry, expected to conceive children. That was the entire reason they were taken. North Korea wanted those children to turn them into spies. Marriage between North Koreans and foreigners was forbidden. Racial homogeneity was nearly universal in the DPRK. Therefore, a spy who didn't look like a typical North Korean was an extremely valuable asset. Someone who could blend into Japanese, European, or American society without raising suspicion. A similar tactic was the seed-bearing strategy. Young North Korean women would be sent abroad to seduce powerful foreign men, politicians, businessmen, people with influence. They'd get pregnant. Then, the North Korean government would use those children to blackmail the men into giving concessions or support from their positions of power. The ends of both schemes were similar: breed a crop of ethnically camouflaged spies who could blend in anywhere North Korea needed them. To this day, we don't know how successful these programs were. We don't know of any confirmed cases where these children were actually used for their intended purpose. It's possible the plan was scrapped. Or maybe they've been so successful that no one ever caught them. North Korea only came clean about the abductions in 2002 as part of diplomatic negotiations with Japan. Still, the numbers they confessed to, no more than 13 people, are much lower than what survivors and investigators suggest. Just 5 abductees were returned to Japan that year. The fates of dozens of other missing people and their children remain unknown. But kidnapping wasn't North Korea's only criminal behavior in the 1980s. 2 horrendous terrorist attacks on foreign soil shocked the world and increasingly isolated the DPRK. The first was an attempted assassination of the South Korean president during a state visit abroad. October 9, 1983. South Korean President Chun Doo-hwan was visiting Rangoon, modern-day Yangon, in Burma. He and a host of other officials and advisors were scheduled to attend a wreath-laying ceremony at the Martyrs' Mausoleum, a memorial dedicated to Burmese national heroes. At 10:25 a.m., just before the ceremony was due to start, a bomb hidden in the building by North Korean agents exploded. The blast destroyed the memorial. 21 people killed, 46 wounded. Among the dead were several high-ranking South Korean officials, the foreign minister, the deputy prime minister, along with journalists and Burmese civilians. Luckily for President Chun, his car had been caught in traffic. He escaped unharmed. North Korea was an obvious suspect. Police quickly identified 3 North Korean military officers who'd secretly entered Yangon and received a package from a North Korean diplomatic mission. That package was later confirmed to contain explosives. Police closed in, but the suspects didn't go quietly. One was killed in a firefight after taking down 3 police officers. The remaining 2 were captured after attempting suicide with a grenade. One of these men, Kang Min-chul, avoided the death penalty by confessing the details and implicating the regime. The Rangoon bombing shattered North Korean relations with multiple countries. Myanmar was especially appalled that Pyongyang would attempt to murder a foreign leader at a sacred site within a neutral country. But North Korea wasn't done. 4 years later, came an even worse crime. November 29th, 1987. Korean Air Flight 858 was flying from Baghdad to Seoul with several stopovers. Two North Korean agents, working on Kim Jong-il's direct orders, boarded the plane using false Japanese passports. They spoke fluent Japanese, taught to them by some of the captured Japanese citizens from the kidnapping program. The agents secretly planted an explosive device disguised as a portable radio in the overhead luggage compartment above their seats. Then they left the plane during a stopover in Abu Dhabi. The plane continued its journey. Passengers and crew had no idea about the deadly package they carried. A few hours later, the bomb detonated over the Andaman Sea in Southeast Asia. All 115 people on board were killed instantly. The agents tried to flee through the Middle East, but were caught in Bahrain. They both attempted suicide. One succeeded. The survivor, a woman named Kim Hyeon-hui, was detained and quickly linked to the attack. Investigation and interrogation revealed the truth. Kim Hyeon-hui had been taken from a young age and forced through North Korea's spy program, trained to be completely loyal to the regime. Kim Jong-il personally ordered her and her partner to bomb the plane. The goal? Scare South Korea and frighten people away from the upcoming 1988 Olympics in Seoul. Kim Hyeon-hui was sentenced to death. But she was pardoned by the South Korean government, who argued the indoctrinated young woman was as much a victim as anyone else. It was controversial. Hyeon-hui lives with constant security to this day, out of fear of revenge from victims' families or assassination by the North Korean government. She has since denounced the regime and appears genuinely remorseful. But the decision to let her off the hook angered many people. The murder of 115 people aboard Flight 858 was one of the most egregious acts of violence committed by North Korea since the Korean War. The international community was outraged. The United States officially declared North Korea a state sponsor of terrorism. Of course, North Korea denied everything. They called it a fabrication and claimed innocence. But the evidence against them was overwhelming and unquestionable. Kim Jong-il's fingerprints were all over both attacks. His emergence as heir apparent coincided with North Korea's descent into international terrorism. But while external problems mounted, Kim Il-sung tried to distract the people with something shiny. Massive internal projects to inspire national pride. Some would succeed. Others would become monuments to failure. The 1980s saw Kim Il-sung fund massive construction projects. Some genuinely useful, others mere exercises in vanity, and some spectacular failures. The Nampo Dam on the west coast was the great internal achievement of the decade. Built between 1981 and 86, this massive $4 billion tidal barrage separates the Taedong River from the Yellow Sea. It prevents seawater contamination of the river, allowing it to supply fresh water for human consumption, industrial use, and agriculture. It's undeniably a feat of engineering. Still, a proud icon of regime propaganda and a popular tourist destination. The Nampo Dam actually serves a purpose. The Juche Tower? Not so much. The Juche Tower is a 560-foot tall monument to the regime's ideology standing in Pyongyang. It makes for a pretty sight. It was an impressive 70th birthday gift to Kim Il-sung. But it was little more than a monument to the cult of the Kim dynasty. At least the Juche Tower was completed. Unlike Pyongyang's other flagship 80s project, the Ryugyong Hotel, this 1,000-foot-tall pyramid-shaped skyscraper towers above the Pyongyang skyline. It was supposed to be an icon of a modernizing North Korea. Planned to have restaurants, guest rooms, casinos, and lounges, all designed to attract foreign visitors and, crucially, foreign investment. What North Korea actually got was an endless money pit. Construction and planning problems plagued the project from the start. It was begun in 1987, intended to be completed for Kim Il-sung's 80th birthday in 1992. The birthday came and went. Construction continued. Then it was abandoned. The Ryugyong Hotel remains unfinished to this day. It was meant to be a monument to the nation's greatness. Instead, it stands as a symbol of the vanity and wastefulness of a regime that would blow billions on prestige projects, while ordinary citizens sank deeper into poverty. But vanity projects were the least of North Korea's problems as the 80s ended. Because the entire foundation of the communist world was about to crumble. And North Korea would have to decide how to survive. Change hit the world hard and fast. And for all its isolation, even North Korea felt the effects. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, Moscow became increasingly skeptical of North Korea and tried to push it toward rolling back totalitarian control. Moscow's first formal delegation to Seoul in 1987 was a disaster for the North's hardline against the South. It forced Pyongyang to begin its own diplomatic engagement with Seoul in the years after. Under Deng Xiaoping, China rolled back aggressive state control of the economy and embraced limited economic liberalization. This led China to open up to the West, leaving North Korea to become something of an embarrassing irritant. Beijing didn't abandon its old ally, economic aid continued. But diplomatic support for North Korea became less vocal as China sought a new place in the world order. Then came 1991. The USSR collapsed. The rapid disintegration shocked allies and enemies alike. For North Korea, it cut off a major source of support. No more Soviet subsidies. No more guaranteed trade partner. No more diplomatic muscle backing them up. As global communism collapsed around them, North Korea withdrew even deeper into itself. The regime re-anchored in Juche. They insisted North Korea's self-reliance was the key that would allow the nation to survive while other communist countries failed. Given China's liberalization and Gorbachev's opening to the West, Pyongyang probably wasn't wrong. Opening itself to new ideas could well have been fatal for their totalitarian system. So, the hermit nation doubled down on isolation. But isolation alone wouldn't protect them. North Korea sought protection in something else. Something that would make the world think twice about threatening them. Nuclear weapons. North Korea had been eyeing nuclear technology for decades. They had nuclear power plants, largely thanks to Soviet support. But they were still far from making nuclear weapons. In the 90s, the US began putting increasing pressure on North Korea to open its reactors to international inspectors. In theory, the North's interest in nuclear technology was purely for energy. The loss of fuel supplies and subsidies from the USSR had compromised the country's energy sector. But the risk of them repurposing nuclear material into weapons was obvious. Better to stop them before they could weaponize that material than wait for them to do it. March 1993. North Korea suddenly withdrew from the International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It triggered the first global nuclear scare of the post-Cold War world. There was talk of nuclear war. A North Korean diplomat threatened his nation would turn Seoul into a sea of fire. Like every North Korean nuclear scare since, the boasting came to nothing. They didn't have the will or weapons to follow through. Then, in June 1994, former US President Jimmy Carter arrived for negotiations. He managed to convince Kim Il-sung to scale back the nuclear program if the US agreed to provide safer, non-weaponizable alternatives for the DPRK's energy needs. For a moment, it looked like things might actually change. The world had forced a readjustment. North Korea agreed to accept international help, Western help, for a critical part of its economy. Even better, Kim agreed to host a meeting with the South Korean president in Pyongyang in late July 1994. An unprecedented diplomatic gesture. A glimpse of hope for a more cooperative North Korea. But that glimpse wouldn't last. And neither would Kim Il-sung. July 7th, 1994. Just before noon. 82-year-old Kim Il-sung collapsed at his private residence in Gyeongsang province. He'd suffered a massive heart attack. The best doctors in the country were immediately flown in. They did everything they could. But in the early hours of July 8th, the great leader of North Korea was declared dead. The state had been secretly preparing for this moment for years. Arrangements for national announcements, public mourning, and an elaborate funeral were already in place. Still, tradition demanded his death only be announced 34 hours later. Every North Korean remembers where they were when they heard the news. Neighbors gathered around the only television on the street. Students were called together so announcements could be made to entire schools. Production lines in factories halted as the news spread. The 34,000 statues of Kim Il-sung dotted around the country became instant pilgrimage points. The nation was consumed with grief. From the outside, the outpouring seems bizarre. Was it real or performance? Genuine emotion or fear of punishment for not seeming sad enough? Eyewitnesses vary in their answers. Many North Koreans had never known life outside the Kim cult. For them, the loss of the great leader was a genuine emotional blow that upended their entire worldview. They'd been taught from birth that Kim Il-sung was eternal, that he embodied the nation itself. His death was incomprehensible. Of course, there were others who saw him as a tyrant. But they couldn't voice it. They knew what happened to people who dared criticize him in the past. Better to mourn publicly and stay safe. The truth was probably a mix of both. Kim Il-sung's state funeral reportedly attracted 2 million people to Pyongyang. Video footage showed weeping crowds falling to their knees as the funeral convoy rolled past. Women collapsed into their husbands' arms. Men sobbed openly. It's impossible to draw a clear line between what was real grief and what was performance. One person who was definitely performing was Kim Jong-il. For him, his father's funeral was the first official act of his new regime. Kim Il-sung was laid to rest in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun in a glass coffin. His embalmed body can still be seen by visitors today. He was also made eternal president of the Democratic People's Republic, a symbol of his continued presence in the political and ideological life of North Korea. Take a moment to reflect on Kim Il-sung's life. Modern historians like to move away from great man narratives. But Kim Il-sung was undeniably a special figure. His personality cult and practical power made him the most important person in his nation for half a century. He used that influence to reshape the lives of millions. Few people ever lived such an impactful life. Kim must have been disappointed. Despite his efforts to hide it, North Korea had fallen behind the South in prosperity, industry, technology, education, diplomacy, essentially everything that mattered. Dreams of reunification seemed like distant memories. Western military technology continued to eclipse their outdated Soviet-era weapons. Newfound diplomatic channels between North and South showed acceptance that division might be permanent. The continued economic rise of capitalist nations, China's liberalization, and the USSR's collapse painted a grim picture for Kim's beloved Marxist-Leninist ideology. Many would say, good riddance. Kim Il-sung, directly or indirectly, caused the deaths of millions through wars, death camps, firing squads, and famines. For every person shedding tears in Pyongyang's streets, there were probably many more around the world celebrating the demise of one of the century's most brutal dictators. But if anyone hoped the great leader's death would improve things in North Korea, they were about to be sorely disappointed. Because Kim Jong-il's reign would prove far worse. The arduous march was coming. Kim Jong-il lacked his father's revolutionary credentials. So, propaganda worked overtime to compensate. The regime churned out absurd claims about his life and abilities. According to official propaganda, he was born on a sacred mountain and a new star appeared in the sky to mark his birth. His mood could change the weather. Storms obeyed his emotions. He was supposedly a creative genius. Kim wrote 1,500 books and operas during his life. Ideological works flowed from his pen, like scriptures from a prophet. But maybe his greatest creation came in the 2000s, when he invented a reward for outstanding students, a piece of meat stuck between two pieces of bread. The West quickly ripped off this innovation and called it a hamburger. Kim was also a peerless athlete. During his first game of bowling, he hit a perfect 300. Then there was his legendary golfing talent, 11 holes in one during his first round in Pyongyang. He was so good he decided never to play again. Why would he, when he was already the best in the world? Even his toilet habits were mythologized. According to the government, Kim Jong-il never needed to use the bathroom. He didn't deal with the basic bodily needs that plagued mere mortals. It's likely North Korean propaganda was bending the truth a little bit. In reality, almost nothing is known about Kim Jong-il's private life. He had multiple mistresses and at least 6 children, though more might have existed out of public view. His undying love of Western films was a poorly kept secret. Beyond that, we know almost nothing about the man behind the propaganda. But reality was about to test whether this genius could lead a nation. And he would fail spectacularly. Between debt, isolation, energy crises, and economic stagnation, it would have taken an extraordinary leader to meet the challenges facing North Korea. Kim Jong-il did not measure up. 1994. Flooding caused crop failures across the nation. With food aid from the USSR long gone and the country's collectivized agriculture on a knife's edge, North Korea fell into a catastrophic famine. The regime euphemistically called it the Arduous March. Hundreds of thousands of people began to starve. Social order broke down. The black market became a lifeline for desperate families who were easily exploited. Many people were forced to migrate illegally in search of food. Food riots erupted in Hamhung and Sinuiju. Roaming gangs of starving orphans took to the streets. The famine had political consequences. In autumn 1995, senior military officers in Hamhung held secret meetings discussing the possibility of overthrowing Kim for his failures. State security discovered the plot. All officers were arrested and shot. Kim Jong-il was characteristically evasive about the crisis. In a December 1996 speech, he downplayed it as merely a food problem. He was more concerned about the party's reputation than the suffering of his people. He blamed local officials for failing to properly educate the masses in socialist ideas. He lamented that the food problem is creating a state of anarchy, but offered no real solutions. Kim was even reluctant to accept food aid from China because he felt it weakened and degraded the country. In 1997, drought extended the famine for another year. As the crisis raged, Kim scrambled to protect the regime's reputation. He made it illegal to utter the words famine or starvation in public or private. Violators could expect a visit from the Simhwajo, a secret police force established in 1996 specifically to target those who tarnished the government's image. No one was safe. The agricultural secretary was executed by firing squad. The General Party secretary was tortured to death. Provincial and municipal leaders disappeared, never to be seen again. Over 10,000 people were killed and another 15,000 sent to concentration camps by this shadowy organization. Despite their efforts to hide it, international observers and NGO workers soon exposed the crisis. By the late 90s, Pyongyang was forced to accept food aid, which finally brought the disaster under control. But not before countless people had perished. Pyongyang's official estimate is that 220,000 people died. International observers insisted it was far higher, anywhere between 600,000 and 3.5 million. The famine might explain one of the biggest skirmishes between North and South since the armistice. With North Koreans starving, fishing grounds in the Yellow Sea looked awfully tempting. June 1999. North Korea sent patrol and fishing boats across the disputed naval boundary near Yeonpyeong Island. South Korea responded with their own patrols. For several days, both sides played cat and mouse, neither wanting to restart the war. Then South Korea launched a bumping offensive, ships literally ramming each other. On June 15th, a surrounded North Korean patrol boat panicked and opened fire. 15 minutes of combat followed. One North Korean ship sank, 5 were damaged, at least 17 sailors died. The South had only minor injuries. Both sides braced for war. Nothing happened. North Korean propaganda claimed tremendous victory and quickly buried the incident. Kim Jong-il's reign was defined by failure, famine, and humiliation. But he had one achievement to hang his hat on: nuclear weapons. Kim Jong-il placed the military at the center of public life through his Songun, military first, ideology. The military became the model for all society. Military discipline, obedience, and loyalty were to be emulated by everyone. All citizens were cast as soldiers in the endless war against the DPRK's enemies. In 2002, international observers were shocked when North Korea seemingly embraced market economics with the July 1st measures. Rice prices were adjusted to follow the market. Companies got greater freedom. Official private markets were established. But in reality, these laws were little more than legalization of black market trade that had been happening for years. They were acknowledgement of problems, not solutions. The Kaesong Industrial Park opened in 2004 as a joint North-South venture. South Korean companies employed North Korean labor, with wages paid directly to the government. It was an unusually direct attempt to harness capitalist business practices. After a few years, Pyongyang got cold feet and clamped down hard on market trading. Kim Jong-il had not suddenly become a free market fan. As North Korea entered the new millennium, it found itself increasingly villainized. In 2002, President Bush described North Korea alongside Iraq and Iran as an axis of evil. Post 9/11, the US was wary of rogue states sponsoring attacks. Given Kim Jong-il's involvement in terror attacks like Flight 858, it wasn't unreasonable. The nuclear program continued. By 2002, the CIA believed North Korea possessed at least one nuclear weapon. October 2006 brought the first confirmed successful detonation. In 2007, after multiple conferences, North Korea agreed to suspend its program and shut down the Yongbyon reactor in exchange for diplomatic concessions and massive fuel aid. But it was short-lived. The North refused international inspectors and continued rocket tests. When the UN sanctioned them, the DPRK announced it was resuming its weapons program at full capacity. The biggest stumble of Kim's regime came with disastrous money reforms in 2009. Pyongyang announced all existing banknotes would be made worthless with a short window to exchange them for new notes. Daily limits meant most people would lose money. This was intentional, reduce the money supply and wipe out illegal savings. But Kim made a fatal mistake. He felt reforms would punish loyal workers, so government employees would keep the same numerical wage. Since one new won was worth 100 old wons, this was essentially a 10,000% wage increase for nearly everyone. The result was catastrophic. Confusion, chaos, colossal inflation. Prices soared. Shortages of basic goods. For the first time ever, regime overthrow became a real possibility. North Koreans openly complained. A diplomat told a foreign representative, "The government doesn't understand what it's doing." By April 2010, conditions stabilized. High-ranking officials were scapegoated and executed. The regime denied anything bad happened. It was possibly the closest the regime ever came to internal collapse. Internal problems didn't stop external provocations. March 26, 2010. The South Korean ship Cheonan was suddenly rocked by an explosion near Baekneong Island. Within 10 minutes, the ship broke in half and sank. 46 of 104 crew members drowned. An extensive investigation determined a North Korean torpedo had detonated beneath the ship. Fragments were recovered, suggesting a small submarine attack. Pyongyang denied it, supported by China and Russia. South Korea and its allies believe North Korea was responsible. The sinking caused relations to nosedive. Tensions led to another engagement at Yeonpyeong Island later that year. When South Korea performed naval exercises around the disputed island, North Korea fired almost 200 artillery shells at homes and military installations. 4 people were killed, around 20 injured. The South fired back, killing 10 North Korean soldiers before both sides ceased fire. The North blamed the South for provoking them. The South insisted the North bore full responsibility. It's possible the attack was a statement against South Korea's admission to the G20 earlier in 2010. Whatever the reason, Kim Jong-il was likely involved. He'd visited one of the artillery bases the day before. Such blatant provocation needed high-level approval. But if Kim was committed to armed conflict, South Korea was about to catch a lucky break. December 19th, 2011. The government announced Kim Jong-il's death from a heart attack 2 days earlier. Supposedly aboard his personal train, though South Korean intelligence was skeptical since their spies reported the train hadn't moved. The real circumstances were completely buried by the regime. The nation was again consumed with grief. Crowds wept at the announcement. An elaborate funeral spectacle for the tearful masses. How sincere it was remains debatable. Kim Jong-il ruled less than half his father's length. No thrown-out occupiers. No wars against great enemies. Just a reign of clear economic deprivation and famine. Further decline into a pariah state, a laughingstock of the international community. The propaganda didn't slow. According to the regime, storms paused and the sky glowed red at his death. He was given the posthumous title Grand Marshal, a symbol of the military focus under his leadership. Time for a new Kim. Untested, inexperienced, unknown to the world. Kim Jong-un's era was about to begin. Kim Jong-un was not originally meant to be successor. His elder half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, was the intended heir until he embarrassed the nation by getting caught with a fake passport trying to visit Tokyo Disneyland in 2001. The new Kim had spent most of his childhood outside North Korea. He was educated in Europe during the 90s, first Switzerland, then Germany. By all accounts, he was a normal kid. Quiet but generally pleasant. No one expected he was destined to be a totalitarian dictator. He loved basketball from a young age and remains a fan to this day. Classmates remember he was into video games. He was an enthusiastic player who sketched Michael Jordan in class. Shy normally but confident and competitive on the court. Kim returned to North Korea to study at Kim Il-sung University. Little is known about his life until his father suffered a stroke in 2008. This health scare forced consideration of succession. In 2009, word spread that a new heir had been chosen. Kim Jong-un stepped into the spotlight in late 2010. He was promoted to 4-star general despite having 0 military experience. He began attending events and on-the-spot guidance sessions with his father. Propaganda signalled him as heir apparent, but he was never officially announced before his father's demise. It must have been a shock to find power falling into his hands so soon. For him and everyone else in Pyongyang. With little grounding in running the country and plenty of foreign experience under his belt, it was no surprise Kim Jong-un would cause changes. Big changes. A hallmark of Kim Jong-un's tenure has been a pivot away from the military and back toward the party. Party officials, not military officials, increasingly became the most influential figures. The Permanent National Defense Commission was abolished in favor of a State Affairs Commission, focused less on external military threats and more on internal economic and social goals. This change had several causes. Kim Jong-un himself doesn't have strong military credentials, unlike his father. His military titles are ceremonial. The decreasing emphasis also reflected a changing world. The prospect of resolving disputes with military force is more unlikely than ever. Enemies are now incomparably more advanced on the battlefield. The military is still important, but it's not the absolute priority it was under his father. The generals have lost their place to party officials and industrial managers. The biggest threat to the regime emerged within the family. Kim Jong-un came to see one in his uncle, Jang Song-thaek. Jang was a veteran administrator with decades of experience and many loyal allies. The prospect of him succeeding Kim Jong-il had been considered by foreign intelligence. The old guard couldn't have been thrilled to be led by young, inexperienced Kim Jong-un. Jang represented a potential alternative. At first, Jang maintained significant power. He took a leading role in diplomatic relations with China. But by late 2012, Kim began pushing him out. He was moved out of diplomatic affairs and excluded from national security meetings. The breaking point appears to have been over-control of fisheries in the Yellow Sea. The New York Times reported that gunfire was exchanged between forces loyal to Jang and those loyal to Kim. Shortly after, Jang was stripped of his posts, accused of treason, and arrested. A scathing 3,000-word statement declared him a traitor. He was accused of crimes ranging from conspiracy to corrupt the youth to half-heartedly clapping. December 12, 2013. Jang was executed by firing squad. Some allies also fell. Most harshly, Deputy Security Minister Oh Sang-hon was burned to death with a flamethrower in 2014. It was the most high-profile purge in DPRK history. A powerful statement that Kim Jong-un was no less ruthless than his predecessors. Kim has tried to show himself as a softer, more friendly leader than his father. In July 2012, he shocked the world by appearing at a flashy pop concert in Pyongyang, complete with Western music and unusually scandalous costumes. Performers dressed as Mickey Mouse and Winnie the Pooh. His wife Ri Sol-ju appeared publicly. Previous wives and mistresses had been hidden. It suggested this new Kim was more approachable, more human, less detached. Experts attribute this to his Swiss childhood. He grew up experiencing Western culture and didn't expect to be leader. It's natural for him to be less hostile to the West and less aloof. Nowhere has this been more apparent than his love of basketball. In 2013, legendary player Dennis Rodman received an invite to visit Pyongyang. He accepted, and this started one of history's most bizarre friendships. Rodman has visited Kim several times. They've been pictured watching games and laughing together. In 2014, Rodman was criticized for singing Happy Birthday to the dictator. While Rodman has no official diplomatic role, his friendship has been considered a potential soft power tool. Though no diplomatic progress has been achieved, it remains one of the most unusual anecdotes in an already unusual country's history. But Kim's acknowledgement of foreign culture is tightly controlled and very limited. In many ways, he's harsher than his predecessors. He's instituted harsh cultural laws designed to protect against foreign influence. Only a handful of people may access the global internet. The average North Korean can only access Kwangmyong, an entirely isolated network where the regime controls all information. K-pop has been described as a vicious cancer by Kim. The New York Times reported 7 people were executed for listening to or sharing K-pop music. Western fashion is prohibited. As of 2017, there are 15 state-permitted haircuts designed to be practical for the socialist worker. These laws make sense to the regime's internal logic. Allowing uncontrolled Western culture risks the fate of the USSR or China. K-pop itself isn't the issue, it's what it represents. An unstoppable wave of foreign influence that the regime must contain to protect North Korea's way of life. Kim Jong-un has re-emphasized Byungjin, the idea that economic future is inseparable from acquiring nuclear weapons. Education is pivoted toward it. The best students enter nuclear fields. Graduates are snapped up by the weapons development sector. While Kim Jong-il created the first weapon, Kim Jong-un's task was delivery. His regime has been especially interested in ballistic missile technology. December 2012. The Kwangmyong-3 satellite launch was roundly condemned as a thinly veiled missile test. Early 2013 brought claims of another nuclear device detonation. A North Korean diplomat threatened final destruction of South Korea at a Geneva disarmament conference. November 2017. The DPRK test-fired its first nuclear-capable ballistic missile, the Hwasong-15. This test was critical because it proved North Korea had missiles capable of hitting the continental United States. While the nuclear program grabs headlines, arguably Pyongyang's most potent modern weapon is cyber warfare. Kim Jong-il once said, "If the internet is like a gun, cyber attacks are like atomic bombs." North Korea maintains an army of talented hackers. A 2019 UN report estimated North Korea raised $2 billion from cybercrime. In 2014, North Korean hackers broke into Sony systems after the company released The Interview, a comedy about assassinating Kim Jong-un. They leaked emails, salaries, scripts, and unreleased films. The company was crippled for days. A more elaborate attack occurred in 2015 and 16 when hackers infiltrated Bangladesh National Bank. They attempted to withdraw almost $1 billion. They made off with $101 million before security caught on. In 2016, North Korean hackers stole over 200 gigabytes of top-secret military intelligence from South Korea, including detailed plans for conflict and an assassination plot for Kim Jong-un. The worst cyber attack was 2017 ransomware that struck 300,000 computers worldwide. Targets included Microsoft and the British National Health Service. It demanded Bitcoin payment and caused billions in damages. The world has adapted, and governments take the threat seriously. But it's only a matter of time until Pyongyang's hackers strike again. Since 2013, tightly controlled tourist groups have been allowed to enter North Korea. Regime officials travel everywhere with groups. Itineraries must be adhered to without question. Tourists may not ask unapproved questions or enter unapproved places. Tourist rules are rigidly enforced. One American student learned this tragically. Otto Frederick Warmbier was a bright, friendly college student who loved to travel. In December 2015, he visited North Korea. After a 5-day tour, he was ready to go home. At the airport terminal, 2 soldiers took him away. He was accused of stealing a propaganda poster from his hotel. This is extremely illegal and seen as an attack on the regime. He gave a confession, claiming the US government manipulated him. He was sentenced to 15 years in a labor camp. The US negotiated for 17 months. In June 2017, he was finally released. But something was horribly wrong. The North Koreans said he'd been in a coma since April 2016. They blamed food poisoning. He was breathing but completely paralyzed and unresponsive, kept alive only with a feeding tube. Doctors believed his brain had been deprived of oxygen, causing permanent damage. Suggestions included water torture. With no hope of recovery, his feeding tube was removed, June 19, 2017. People have been escaping North Korea since its inception. Numbers peaked at several thousand per year under Kim Jong-il. Under Kim Jong-un, escapes declined sharply due to improved border security. In 2022, just 67 defectors made it to South Korea. Even the leader's own brother wasn't safe. In February 2017, Kim Jong-nam was assassinated in Malaysia with VX nerve agent. 2 women attacked him, thinking they were part of a prank show. Kim Jong-un had ordered his half-brother's murder. The election of Donald Trump in 2016 caused concern. Twitter became a bizarre diplomacy avenue where Trump threatened Little Rocket Man with his much bigger nuclear button. Following tensions from the Hwasong test, North Korea's diplomatic tune suddenly changed. Early 2018 saw North Korea send a delegation to the Seoul Winter Olympics. In June, Kim and Trump met in Singapore, agreeing to work toward denuclearization. June 2019 brought an unprecedented meeting at the DMZ. For a while, things looked up. Then, October 2019, talks broke down. Kim wasn't ready for nuclear concessions. He soon resumed tests. January 2020. COVID hit. North Korea's isolation proved a blessing. They sealed borders easily. Officially, they avoided COVID for 2 years. May 2022, they announced their first case. Official numbers claimed only 74 deaths, despite 5 million cases. Scholars believe the actual toll was higher, but far smaller than countries facing early waves. 2023 and 24 have been relatively quiet. Continued missile tests. Support for Russia's Ukraine invasion. Continued isolation. The question remains, how long can this last? 75 years since the armistice. Still no peace treaty. The Korean War technically never ended. The DMZ remains one of the most militarized borders on Earth. 3 generations of Kims. Kim Il-sung, the guerrilla fighter who became a god. Kim Jong-il, the incompetent heir who presided over famine and isolation. Kim Jong-un, the young dictator trying to balance old ways with a new world. 25 million people live under one of the world's most oppressive regimes. But they're not statistics. They're normal people with hopes, dreams, and families. Their lives shaped by the choices of three men and an ideology created to justify their power. The question remains, how long can this last? Can a hermit kingdom survive in a connected world? Will reform come from within or collapse from without? Will reunification ever happen? One thing is certain. The full story of North Korea is not yet finished. As long as the Kim dynasty rules, as long as the 38th parallel divides the peninsula, as long as people suffer under totalitarian control, the story continues. And the world watches, waiting to see what happens next in Earth's most secretive nation.